So when your model scene is finished, there's kind of three things we need to talk about. Lighting, cameras, and rendering. And they all kind of go hand in hand, so it's kind of hard difficult to talk about one without talking about the other. First of all, let's kind of look at rendering. So rendering is where we take this, and this is just a preview, and we export it as images out of Maya. So let's go to the rendering options. They are up here, the little clapperboard, and the little clapperboard with the cog is your rendering settings. So click on that. Now Maya has a few different ways that you can render. They have different render engines, and they all have produce slightly different results. What at the moment is going to be probably set to Arnold renderer. I recommend, so click from the drop down, that you use Maya software. So we're going to use that, and then we'll look at a few of these options. So first of all, you can set your file name. So you could set that to room. You could use any name that you want. I'm going to render it as a PNG. We'll not worry about this just yet. You can see that what camera, automatically it's using the perspective camera, which is what we're looking through at the moment. How high quality you want the image to be, let's change that to 1080p. So that is 1920 by 1080. That's going to be nice quality. The last thing I'm going to do for now, I'm going to go into this other tab, Maya software, and I'm going to change this anti-aliasing quality to production quality and make sure that it's on highest. And that is all good. So I'm going to close that. Okay, that all looks good. So let's try rendering an image. So if I hit this little blackboard with no icon on it, that will render the current what currently is in the viewport, and you're going to see what's going to happen. So it renders out the scene, but at the moment there's no lights, so it can look a lot better than this. Let's look at adding some lights. So if you go into the rendering tab, these are all the lights that you can use. This is an ambient light, so that will add an equal kind of light to the whole scene with no shadows. I don't really recommend using that one. You've got directional light. This is much more interesting than the ambient light because it's adding a light in just one direction. You get a little arrow so that you can point the light. And if you hit 7 on your keyboard, that will turn on the lights. Just like 6 will turn on textures, 7 turns on the lights. Using the rotation tool, I can angle this light. And I could have, for example, I could have it coming in through one of the windows. And I can change, if you go to your attribute editor, and that's just this little tab here on the right. You can also access it through this little icon here. You can change the color, so I can change it to kind of a blue color. You can change the intensity. That's really great. Now I don't recommend using just one light usually. Usually you want to use a few different lights. So this light next to the directional light, this is a point light. And it's kind of like, if you want to move it around, kind of like a light bulb. It's sending light in every direction. So I could make this a different color as well. I could make this kind of a gold color. And now it's beginning to get a bit more interesting. You've also got spotlights. They're a little bit like a directional light, but you get a little cone so that you can kind of point it like an actual spotlight. And you've got different options, so you can soften it with the drop off. You can change the angle. You can change the angle of the cone. You can change the intensity and the color, just like before. You've also got an area light, and that's like a kind of a light that sends a light in one direction, but in a specific area. So it's a little bit like a directional light, but just in one area. That'll probably do me though. So let's render it and see what it looks like now. That's looking much more interesting. However, the light isn't that realistic, is because it's not casting any shadows. We can turn shadows on if we close that, and if we go into each specific light, so we have to click on the light option. So I'll click on the actual icon, and you can see here this little tab in the attribute editor, a little tab for shadows. There's a couple of different types of shadows. The most simple kind of shadow is these depth map shadows, and I can just click use depth map shadows, and if I render it now, the cone light will be casting shadows from the chair. The other lights at the moment are not casting shadows, so we could turn shadows on for those as well. So for the directional light, let's make this a bit bluer. Just to give it more contrast, go into shadows and click use depth map. And for the point light, we'll do the same thing. And for the point light, we'll do the same thing. And we'll hit render. And there you go, it's kind of casting a much more interesting lighting setup. Now lights aren't super complicated, but where they do spend time is just trying to kind of make it look good, moving things around, playing with the different brightnesses until you've got an effect that you like. So that's lighting. We could go into more detail with different types of shadows and stuff, but I just think I'll keep it simple for now. If you want to know more about lighting, we can talk about that, and the other type of lighting, which is ray trace shadows, which we could look at in future. But that's kind of the very simple nature of lighting. The next thing is you're going to want your camera to kind of explore and zoom around when we actually render this. So there's a couple of different ways, and people choose to do it in different ways. We kind of need to look at how you animate in Maya. So at the bottom you've got a timeline, and this works very similar to how it does in something like Premiere or After Effects or something like that, or any kind of editing software. You've got frames at the bottom, so 10 frames, 20 frames. You can set the amount of frames down here, so I could make it 400 frames long, my timeline. If I wanted it to be longer, you can play through it. You can select the frames per second, but that all looks good. Now you can create a keyframe in Maya just by hitting S, and you can actually keyframe anything. So I create a keyframe for this chair. So if I move the chair here, hit S, and move to the end of my timeline, I could then move it again, and it will keyframe between those two positions. And I could keyframe any setting, so I could have it rotate, hit S, and then have it rotate in different ways. And you can end up with a bit of an animation. You can do that with scale, and you can do that with the lights as well. So if I click on the lights, you'll see the keyframes from the chair disappear when I deselect it. To bring those back, I need to select the chair again. But I can keyframe the light as well, so I can have this spotlight kind of move around. Yes, move the light. I can delete keyframes by right clicking. I'm going to delete. I can also move keyframes around, so I could, if I hold down shift, hold down my left click on my mouse and drag over the timeline, I can move that keyframe around. Now you can also keyframe the camera. So to do that, I need to select the camera in order to animate it. So if I go to view, then go to select camera, I've now got the options for the camera. And you can change your options, so you can, if you know a little bit about cameras, you can change your focal length and all of that. We don't really need to get into that, but you could make it really wide angle by using a lower focal length or a higher focal length. We don't need to get into that now, but that can be useful if you want to play around with that. Hit S on your keyboard to create a keyframe. Move the timeline, and then move the camera. Then hit S again, and then it will keyframe between those two positions. So you can kind of use that to move the camera around the scene if you want to do it that way. So you can kind of explore your scene by doing that. Or let's delete those keyframes. So I'm going to hold down Shift, hold down left click, drag all of those keyframes and delete. So now my camera is no longer animated. A lot of people choose to use a turntable camera that will kind of go neatly all around your scene, and it can be looped that way. So if I go to the modeling drop down and I go to animation and I go to visualize, and I go to create turntable. Now if you want it to kind of circle around, you'll need to have your scene selected so that it will circle around that scene in particular. So select your scene, or select some objects in your scene, and go to visualize, and then click the little checkbox for create turntable, and that will bring up the options. So number of frames, that's how long it's going to take to go around the object. My timeline is about 400 frames long, so I'll put in 400, and you can select whether you want it to go clockwise or counterclockwise. You can click turntable, and now if I play it back, it's going to go around my scene, and you could make it longer and shorter by changing the timeline and the frames. If I go to my outline, which is here, that shows everything in my scene, so it shows all of the objects, it shows the lights. This group 1 is actually the turntable camera. So if I want to select and change or delete the turntable camera, I need to go to my outliner and I can delete it here. And you can see if I've got the group selected, you can see the 2 keyframes. So I can make it shorter and longer here. Or longer. There. So that's the turntable. Now we need to actually render this as an actual video. So let's go back to our render settings, so the little clapperboard with the cog, and I need to set this up. Now I'm going to go back to the Common tab. Now we in Maya don't tend to render things as video, we tend to render them as images. And the reason we do that is because if it's rendering can take quite a while, and if it freezes or breaks, if we're rendering video, we'll lose all those frames. Whereas if we render it image by image, like a stop motion film, then if it freezes, we'll keep all of the frames up to the point where it froze, and we can then just restart the rendering from that frame. Hopefully that makes sense. So at the moment it's set to render a single frame. So we want to render all of these frames, all 400 frames. So we need to change that. So from single frame, go to name #ext. So once you've selected that, you can then select the amount of frames that's going to render. So at the moment it's just going to render 10 frames. That's the beginning of the animation. We want it to render 400. So I want it to start at frame 1 and end at frame 400. Next thing, scroll down and you can see there's actually 2 renderable cameras now, the perspective camera and the turntable camera. We just want, because I'm using the turntable camera, we just want the turntable camera. So I'm going to delete the perspective camera, otherwise it will render both, which we don't want. Make sure that it's on HD 1080p. Make sure that it's on highest quality. Exit the render settings, and then change the drop down from animation to rendering and go to render sequence. And now it's going to start rendering my scene. If it's a very complicated scene, like a much more complicated diorama than this one, it's going to take quite a while to render, and you might want to render it overnight, or you might want to render it you want part at a time, so you might render 20 frames and then come back and render some more. If you want to cancel the render, like if you want to start doing something else with your computer, you can just hold down escape and it will stop rendering, and you can close the renderer. And you can check where those images are being rendered to. It's going to be in Documents, Maya, Projects, Default, Images, and it might be in TMP. And you can see the rendering is taking place there. And you can see they're slowly being added. So it's going to be rendering separate images, and we need to turn this into video. In order to do that, you can use something like After Effects. And it's very easy to do in After Effects. You can just go to New Composition from Footage, then find your images. So I can just go to Maya, Projects, Default, Images, TMP. And then in order to import them, I just need to make sure that PNG sequence is ticked. And it's going to import all of those images and turn them into a video. So now you can see they're all strung together into a video, and you can actually render that out of After Effects very easily. Just export, and you can either use the media encoder or the render queue. So I could then just render it, and that's going to render it as a video. So if you want any help with that, let me know. But that is how you light, animate and render a scene. Hopefully that was helpful.